Hello and welcome to this fourth video in the Rxindi tutorial series. In the previous parts we explicitly skipped over the details of the data source input file, and how data is exactly selected from it. That will be the topic of this video. Let's start by opening a template that we used before. This time, we'll also peek into the actual content of the data file we are using. Rxindi supports data input files of type Excel, CSV, XML and JSON. The file type being used in this example is XML, which, if you're not familiar with it, looks a lot like HTML source code. Very simply put, it is a collection of nested named elements, within angular brackets, and their values. In reality there's a bit more to it, but this basic general concept is enough for now. At this point it is important to make a distinction between file types and the actual structure of a file. Meaning that a file of type XML always use a similar format of describing elements and their values. But the structure of the XML file, meaning which elements are present, and how they are nested, can differ from file to file. Here is an example of two files of type XML, with a different structure. The same is true for the other supported file types. For instance, in an Excel file, the file type is always the same: worksheets, rows and columns. But the actual location of specific data in the spreadsheet, and its meaning, may differ from file to file. Why is this distinction between file type and structure important? Well, as stated, Rxindi supports files of certain types, like XML. It does not, however, care at all about the structure of said file. For a template, the structure of the file is important though, because the correct elements need to be referenced in order to get data. So, now we know what the data looks like. But how do we actually reference it? Rxindi makes this quite straightforward. You just type the name, or rather, the path, of the element you want to get the data of. Let's have a look at how this works in some more detail. As you can see, the name, item name and coupon code referenced in the output element map exactly to elements in the XML, as shown on the right side. In the XML, these elements are actually child elements of an element called data, which is the root element in the file. The reason why we don't need to include this in the path here is because of something called a context. Now, heads up, things might get a bit complex. Don't worry if you cannot quite follow this next part, it should make sense eventually. In Rxindi, all statements are relative to a certain data context. What this means is that at any given point, there is always exactly one element in the source data that is the currently active base element. Think about it as the current folder you see in your file manager on your operating system. All files and subfolders in it are relative to this current folder. The same is true in Rxindi. All references to data are relative to the currently active context, which is a particular element from the input data. If you want, you can also reference elements by its absolute path. In this case you have to start the path with a /, which means, start from the very root. The default context for any text frame is always the root node, in this case, the element called data. Now you know why we can just use the shorthand, name, to reference the name element. We can also write the long-form path of this by using / data, / and then, name. This is true for any element in the data. It will always have a short form, relative to the current context, and a long form, the absolute path. Certain statements, like loop, row repeat, and place, may change the current context for its child statements, making their relative paths dependent on the parent context. The absolute paths to elements never change though. Here is an overview of all absolute paths of data in this particular file. There are much more possibilities than specifying just a relative or absolute path to select data. For example, conditions, referencing parent elements, and even performing some basic data formatting and transformation. The data selection syntax in Rxindi is based on an industry-standard query language called XPath. You should be able to find a lot of information on XPath online. A link to the official reference documentation is included in the description of this video. The behavior for paths with the output statement is quite straightforward. If you target a text frame, it just takes the exact text from the data and places it in the document. If you target an image frame, then the source data is expected to be a path to an image file. For this you can use the full disk path, or a path relative to the data file. For if statements, you can either write an explicit comparison expression, or point to an element in the data. In the latter case, the condition is considered false if the data is a 0, the text, false, or empty. In other cases, the condition is considered true. Here in this example, an explicit expression is used, comparing the contents of the eligible element with 1. For loop statements, you point to an element that contains child elements to loop over. In this example, the loop loops over each product element. For every iteration, the context for child elements, in this case the output statement for the item name, is changed to the current product. The area of the changed context is here indicated in light blue. Besides pointing to an element for which to loop over its child elements, you can also point to an element that contains a number. Loop will then loop that number of times. But in that case, the context for child statements is not changed. Within the context of the loop, the blue area, there are some special variables available that can be used in child statements. These variables indicate the current index in the loop, the total number of items, and whether the current iteration is over the first or last item. Aside from XML, Rxindi also supports Excel, CSV, and JSON file types as input. When one of these file types are selected, then they are internally first transformed into a standard XML layout. This is done so that the same powerful data query language features can be used, regardless of the input file type. The exact details on how each file type is transformed is out of scope for this video. For details you can check the Rxindi manual. What we will point out, though, is that in the Rxindi user interface, on the panel menu there is a feature called Load into XML Structure. When you have selected any data file, and there is a document open in InDesign, then invoking this command will load the transformed XML in the InDesign XML Structure view, which is a graphical tree representation of the data. This can be useful when you want to understand the structure, and when writing paths. Well, that's it for this video. We've gone quite a bit in depth on data selection in Rxindi, which, granted, is a relatively complex subject. It is quite okay if not everything mentioned here resonated with you. Be sure to continue with the other videos in the Rxindi tutorial series, and if needed, come back to this topic in the future. For now, thank you for watching, and goodbye.